The rain had stopped only an hour ago, leaving the streets slick and reflective, like the city was holding up a fractured mirror to the fading daylight. Jonathan Caldwell stepped out of the black Mercedes sedan, his shoes clicking against the pavement in precise, controlled beats. The chauffeur murmured a polite goodbye, but Jonathan was already half absorbed in the cascade of messages on his phone. His assistant had scheduled 4 back-to-back meetings today, 2 about the Asian market expansion, 1 regarding the quarterly investor call, and 1, well, he didn't even remember the last one. Work was a constant drumbeat, drowning out the quieter thoughts he didn't care to dwell on. 6 months had passed since the divorce, but time had done little to soften the raw edges. If anything, it had made them sharper, more jagged. Amelia's absence wasn't just noticeable in the empty spaces of his penthouse, it was embedded in the rhythm of his days. No more shared breakfasts, no more late-night arguments that somehow ended in laughter. No more scent of her shampoo lingering on his pillow. They had been together for 7 years, married for 4, and their split had been as calculated and meticulous as one of his boardroom mergers. No screaming matches in public, no thrown dishes, no public scandal. Just lawyers in tailored suits, pens scratching across divorce papers, and an unspoken agreement that they would part with dignity. He had convinced himself he didn't love her anymore. It was easier that way. Jonathan adjusted his cufflinks and crossed the street toward Caldwell Enterprises, the towering glass monolith that bore his name. But halfway across the park that separated the parking garage from the office tower, he froze. She was there. Amelia. She sat on a wooden bench beneath a canopy of half-bare maple branches, a soft gray scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose bun, a few strands framing her face. Even from a distance, he could see something different about her, not just in the way she carried herself, but in the expression she wore. She was smiling, not the polite smile she used to wear for his colleagues at charity galas, nor the strained smile she gave him when he promised, "Next month, I'll take some time off." This was softer, warmer, and then he saw why. In her arms, bundled in a pale cream blanket, was a baby. Jonathan's steps faltered. The sound of the city around him seemed to fade, the rush of traffic, the murmur of passers-by, even the wind stirring the last of the autumn leaves. All that remained was the image before him, Amelia, gazing down at the infant with a tenderness so deep it almost hurt to look at. The child's tiny hand stretched upward, fingers curling, and Amelia lowered her head to brush her lips against the baby's forehead. Her eyes closed briefly, as if memorizing the sensation. Jonathan's breath caught. The timeline began unspooling in his mind before he even wanted it to. 6 months since the divorce. 9 months for a pregnancy. If she had conceived before their split, then. The thought was too big, too dangerous, to finish. He told himself there were other explanations. Maybe the baby wasn't hers. Maybe she was babysitting for a friend. Maybe, but Amelia had never been one for other people's children. She'd always wanted one of her own. She had told him so, many times. He had always answered the same way, someday, when the company isn't in a growth phase. She had stopped asking eventually. Jonathan realized he was staring. He turned abruptly, his jaw tight, and walked into his office building without looking back. The weight of what he'd seen. By the time he reached the top floor, his pulse was still uneven. His secretary began to greet him, but one look at his expression was enough to make her step aside without a word. He shut his office door harder than he intended and moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city as though it might offer an answer. The image of Amelia holding that child replayed in his mind in brutal clarity. He thought about the way she'd cradled the baby close, how her entire body seemed to curve protectively around it. If the baby was his, then Amelia had concealed something monumental from him. She had carried his child, given birth, and said nothing. Not even a word, and if the baby wasn't his, that meant she had moved on in record time, enough to have a child in her arms before the ink on their divorce papers had truly dried. The idea made his chest feel hollow. Neither scenario sat well. Jonathan moved to his desk and pressed the intercom button. "Get Daniel Ward in here," he told his secretary. The directive. Daniel Ward had been Jonathan's head of security for nearly a decade. A former military intelligence officer, he was the kind of man who noticed details others missed and asked few questions, at least out loud. When Daniel arrived, Jonathan didn't bother with small talk. "I need you to find out everything about a child," he said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "A child?" "Yes." Jonathan said, his voice flat. A baby, male or female, I don't know yet. I saw Amelia in the park this morning holding it. I want to know who the child is, where it came from, and, his jaw tightened, if it's mine. Daniel leaned against the chair opposite the desk. That's not the kind of thing you just, look up. There are legal considerations. This is personal, Jonathan cut in. Not corporate. I want it handled discreetly. No one in the office hears about this. Daniel studied him for a long moment. You realize, if the child is yours, you'll have to confront her eventually. And if it's not, I'll deal with that when I know the truth, Jonathan said. For now, I want every possible detail, birth date, hospital records, living arrangements. And I want it fast. Daniel gave a small nod. Understood. The waiting. The hours dragged. Jonathan sat through meetings but heard little of what was said. Numbers swam on spreadsheets, voices became background noise. Whenever his mind drifted, it went back to the park. To Amelia's smile. To the weight of that small body in her arms. By evening, the city outside his penthouse was glowing with the golden haze of sunset. Jonathan sat alone in the living room, a glass of scotch sweating in his hand. He had lived in this space for 2 years with Amelia. Now, it felt less like a home and more like a museum to a life that had ended, her favorite books still on the shelves, the scent of her perfume long faded from the air. He thought of the conversations they'd had in the early days of their marriage. She had spoken about children the way some people speak about dreams, brightly, vividly, with an almost reckless optimism. He had spoken about them in the language of deferrals, after the expansion, after the next acquisition, after we stabilize the board. In truth, he'd been afraid. He had never said so aloud, but the thought of being responsible for another life in a personal, emotional way had terrified him in a way running $1 billion empire never did. Maybe that fear had cost him more than he realized. Memories he couldn't shake. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it did, it brought dreams, Amelia in their old kitchen, barefoot, laughing as she balanced a baby on her hip. The sound of a child's giggle filling the air. Jonathan reaching for them, but somehow never getting close enough. He woke with the uneasy knowledge that, no matter the truth, something had shifted. The possibility that the child was his had planted a seed in his mind, and it was growing roots he couldn't ignore. Daniel's update. 2 days later, Daniel returned with the first thread of information. I tracked Amelia's recent addresses, he said, laying a slim file on Jonathan's desk. She moved into a townhouse in Brookside 3 months ago. It's quiet, middle income, no doorman, no staff. She's been keeping a low profile. And the child? Jonathan asked. Still working on that, Daniel said. But I did confirm she hasn't been seen with any man regularly enough to suggest she's remarried or in a new long-term relationship. As far as neighbors know, it's just her and the baby. Jonathan felt a flicker of something, hope, dread, he wasn't sure. Keep digging. Daniel hesitated. If the child is yours, Jonathan, what then? Jonathan didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the window, to the endless sprawl of the city. Then, he said finally, we start rewriting the last 6 months of my life. The envelope was heavier than Jonathan expected. It sat on his desk like a coiled serpent, waiting to strike. Daniel stood across from him, expression neutral, but his eyes watched carefully, reading Jonathan the way he used to read enemy positions in the field. You might want to sit before you open that, Daniel said quietly. Jonathan ignored the advice. He slit the seal with the edge of a silver letter opener and pulled out the crisp, folded paper. The laboratory logo at the top was small and neat, the typewritten words below stark and inarguable. Paternity probability, 99.98%. The numbers blurred for a moment before coming back into focus. His son. Amelia had given birth to his son. The surge that hit him was confusing, equal parts exhilaration, disbelief, and something dangerously close to rage. He wasn't just looking at a piece of paper, he was looking at the theft of 6 months of his child's life. She never told me, Jonathan said, more to himself than to Daniel. He cut himself off, clenching the report in his fist. I need to see her. Tonight. Daniel hesitated. Jonathan, maybe you should. Now. The drive to Brookside. Brookside was a quiet district, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's dogs by name and the street lamps cast a warm, sleepy glow over manicured lawns. Jonathan's black sedan felt out of place here, too sleek, too expensive, like a predator in a meadow. He parked a few houses down from the townhouse Daniel had identified. The lights inside were on, spilling a soft amber glow through gauzy curtains. For a moment, he just sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel. He'd faced hostile takeovers worth billions without blinking. Yet now, the thought of knocking on that door had his pulse thrumming in his ears. Finally, he stepped out, the cool night air hitting his face, and walked up the short path to her door. The confrontation, Amelia answered after the second knock. She looked different up close, less polished than he remembered, her hair in a loose braid over one shoulder, a cardigan pulled tight around her. But her eyes were exactly the same, and they widened when she saw him. "Jonathan," she said, the surprise in her voice edged with wariness. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said. His tone was flat, but the words carried weight. She glanced over her shoulder toward the living room, and he caught the faint electronic crackle of a baby monitor. "This isn't a good time. It's the only time." For a moment, she didn't move, and then, almost reluctantly, she stepped aside. Inside, the townhouse was modest but warm. A soft, clean scent lingered in the air, laundry soap and something faintly floral. On the coffee table, lay a folded baby blanket and an empty bottle. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward the baby monitor on the counter, the tiny green light blinking. "I saw you in the park," he said. "With him." Amelia froze. "Jonathan, you didn't think I'd notice? You didn't think I'd want to know my own child existed?" Her lips parted, then closed again. "I wasn't going to tell you." The words hit him harder than he expected. "Why?" "Because you didn't want this life," she said quietly. "You told me so, over and over. The company always came first. I didn't want Samuel to grow up with a father who saw him as an inconvenience." Jonathan felt the sting of the truth in her voice, but he didn't let it slow him. "That wasn't your choice to make." Her chin lifted slightly. "It was when I was the one left alone every night. It was when I was the one who had to decide if I could raise a child in the shadow of your empire. You wanted power, Jonathan. I wanted a family. I gave us both what we wanted. The child." The soft cry from the monitor cut through the air like a thread snapping. Amelia disappeared down the hall and returned moments later, cradling a small bundle. Jonathan's heart twisted as he saw the boy, his boy, awake and blinking curiously at the world. The baby had a head of dark hair, cheeks tinged pink, and eyes, Jonathan's eyes, no doubt about it. Amelia's arms tightened around the child. "This is Samuel," she said, her voice softer now. Jonathan stepped forward, unsure if he was asking permission or just taking what was his. Amelia hesitated, then, slowly, placed Samuel into his arms. The baby was warm and surprisingly heavy. Jonathan felt the tiny heartbeat through the blanket, the faint flutter of small breaths. The world outside seemed to fade until it was just the three of them in a bubble of quiet. He looked at Amelia. "I missed the day he was born. His first smile. His first, everything. And you thought I didn't deserve to know." Her eyes glistened. "I thought you wouldn't care." "I care," Jonathan said, the words rough in his throat. "More than you think. The past, unraveled. They talked, or rather, argued, until the clock neared midnight. The past spilled out between them, the nights Jonathan worked late without calling, the promises to start a family, next year, the slow erosion of intimacy until all that was left was the shell of a marriage. "You were already halfway out the door before I even knew I was pregnant," Amelia said. "If I'd told you then, you would have felt obligated, not happy. I wanted Samuel to be wanted. You don't get to decide how I would have felt," Jonathan said. "Maybe I would have surprised you. Or maybe you would have resented us both," she said quietly. That silenced him. The decision. By the time Jonathan left, Samuel was asleep again in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Jonathan stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him, committing the sight to memory. "I'm not going to disappear from his life," he told Amelia. She nodded, but her expression was guarded. "If you mean that, prove it. Not with your name or your money. Prove it by showing up. Every day, if you can." He didn't make promises he wasn't certain he could keep. But this one, he intended to keep. "I will. Weeks of change. The next weeks were unlike anything Jonathan had known. Board meetings were cut short so he could drive to Brookside. Late-night calls from investors went unanswered because he was busy rocking Samuel to sleep or sitting on the floor stacking blocks that Samuel promptly knocked over. At first, Amelia was cautious, watching him like she expected him to vanish at any moment. But slowly, she began to relax, letting him take Samuel for walks around the neighborhood, letting him stay for bedtime stories. Jonathan's world began to reorder itself, not around quarterly reports, but around Samuel's milestones. The first time his son laughed, Jonathan realized he'd never heard a sound so pure. A new threat, but peace was fragile. One evening, as Jonathan arrived at the townhouse, he noticed a car idling at the corner, its headlights off. Inside, a man sat watching the house. Jonathan's instincts, honed by years of corporate battles, told him this wasn't random. He called Daniel the moment he got back to his car. 2 days later, Daniel reported back. The man's name is Eric Harlow. He's a freelance journalist. Been sniffing around Amelia for weeks. My guess, someone leaked your connection to the child. Jonathan felt a cold anger settle in his chest. I want him shut down, legally, if possible. I won't have Samuel dragged into the public eye. Protecting what mattered. The threat forced Jonathan and Amelia into unexpected alliance. They met with lawyers, set up legal protections, and even discussed a public statement to control the narrative. It was during one of these late-night strategy sessions, after Samuel had fallen asleep, that Amelia finally looked at him without the wall in her eyes. You've changed, she said quietly. Maybe I just figured out what matters, he said. She didn't reply, but something in her gaze softened. The quiet turning point. 3 months after that first night in Brookside, Jonathan found himself sitting on the floor of the nursery, Samuel asleep against his chest. Amelia stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame, her expression unreadable. You're good with him, she said. Jonathan looked down at his son, at the tiny hand clutching his shirt. He's mine, he said simply. It wasn't an argument, it wasn't a defense, it was a fact, one that bound him to Samuel and, in some irrevocable way, to Amelia. For now, that was enough. But deep down, Jonathan knew this was only the beginning.